We've all kind of grown accustomed to more established brands and expecting what they would be releasing. But what happens when a newer brand comes up with something that could potentially revolutionize the market? I'm Obi from Obi Audio. Let's talk about the AFUL Performer 5. Before we start though, I would just like to thank Hi-Fi Go and Mr. Neil Clark for holding this review tour for the Philippines. Me and my fellow reviewers are very glad and thankful to have experienced the AFUL Performer 5. Rest assured though, my opinions of the AFUL Performer 5 is going to be of my own honest thoughts, and there is no monetary compensation whatsoever to make my review biased. With that out of the way, let's talk about the AFUL Performer 5, starting with the unboxing. The AFUL Performer 5 comes in a large box with the illustration of the IEMs and some information about the unit in the front and more in-depth specs on the back. Removing the sleeves reveals a black box that, when flipping open the magnet, you are met with the AFUL's logo. Pulling this tab reveals the IEMs themselves and a metal case with the cables. Removing the foam then reveals 6 pairs of tips. Beside that is the necessary paperwork. The tips of the AFUL Performer 5 are all made out of a silicone material and comes in 2 colors. Although the colors doesn't really change the narrowness or the wideness of the bore, instead, it's the size that the smaller has a more narrower bore while the wider or the larger tips have a wider bore. They were honestly quite rough and reminded me of the AT08 tips. I'm not really a big fan of them, but again, your mileage may vary. These tips are serviceable for the most part. Now let's move on to the build and fit. Starting with the cable, information about it is quite minimal. All we can really confirm is that it is a removable 8-core straight jack with either a 3.5 or 4.4 termination and comes in a 2-pin 0.78mm interface and is of about 1.2 meters in length. It's a nice, soft, and malleable cable that responds very well to be Rodi wrapped. The chin cinch is also very usable and the strands do not make my sensitive face itch. The ear hooks are also quite nicely implemented. However, if we were speaking from experience, these kinds of cables have the tendency to stiffen up over time. Usually a few months, around 5 months is usually the time where it starts to get stiff, but your mileage may vary. My cables particularly could have that factor into it, but AFUL Performer 5s might not have. I'm not really one to say, as I've only had the AFUL Performer 5 for just about a week, but regardless, really nice cable. It's definitely a perfectly usable cable that is quite memory free and is honestly very comfortable and really well made. Moving on to the IEMs themselves, they use a hybrid driver configuration with 4 balanced armatures and 1 dynamic driver. Information about the drivers is currently unknown, with only 2 BAs for the mids and 2 BAs for the highs, but the rest of the driver setup and its specs are quite unknown. The Performer 5 does feature Envision Tech and RLC to improve bass and have less distortion respectively. It's all housed in a medical grade resin with a nice faceplate to cover it all up. Overall, the build of the AFUL Performer 5 isn't really the most premium, but I will say this is one of the most comfortable IEMs that I've worn ever. The wings and the overall shape just fit into my ear almost perfectly, but again, not really the most premium build. Seal is also very impressive, but again, it is using only passive noise cancelling, so it doesn't completely cancel the noise, but for what it is, pretty good. And lastly, there's no pressure buildup inside my ears, which I absolutely loathe, and I'm so glad that AFUL Performer 5 does not have that, despite having 4 balanced armatures, which is usually the part where it really gets a lot pressuring in the ear. Overall though, again, not the most premium feeling build, but definitely one of the most comfortable, and I'll honestly say that the faceplate is really well done, although kind of similar to another IEM. But again, I'm not complaining. But now, we can finally move on to the sound impressions. Before we proceed, the tests were done on a Venture Electronics Megatron, Zishan U1, Not by VE Abigail, and the Huawei Nova 7 SE. My test tracks can be found below in the description along with a document explaining what to look for in each track. The AFUL Performer 5 features a slight U-shaped sound signature with a bit of an emphasis on the bass region. It is quite easy to drive, as even on my smartphone it would sound good, but again, using at least a dongle DAC would definitely make your experience with the Performer 5 much better. Starting with the bass, the Performer 5 is a sub-bass dominance over the mid-bass, with the sub-bass having a tasteful amount of elevation, although I would say it's not enough for a bass head. The mid-bass is also well tuned with good body, but there is a slight issue with the dynamics and just the texture and detail happening around in this region. I felt that it was kind of sloppy or slow sounding, that it doesn't really pair up with a rich and powering sub-bass. Instruments and vocals in this region tend to sound a bit mushy and undefined. It's not the worst, obviously, but it's not really the best that I could think of in terms of bass response. I really do find that a lot of instruments and vocals lack this grit and impact and texture that I really look for in these kinds of tuning. But it's not really the worst. Again, it's actually pretty well tuned, but it does lack a bit of dynamics. Overall though, I think that it has really good bass response in terms of tonality and overall balance. However, the dynamics kind of is lacking, and it's more on the lush side rather than the detailed and impactful side. Not necessarily a con per se, but it's definitely something that I would have preferred to have a bit more detail and definition. For that, I will be giving the AFUL Performer 5 a 6 out of 10 for bass response. Now, let's move on to the mid-range, where it's somewhat underemphasized and occasionally lacks engagement and kind of sounds distant. This is also the part where the incoherency starts to be more evident in terms of how the driver setup is pulled off, as with the bass being a bit slower, it moves on to the mid-range, kind of affecting the notes and the details in male vocals and instruments, particularly guitars and a lot of string instruments actually. And then when it starts moving to the upper mid-range, again, no harshness, really smooth, really well tuned, but it is a much snappier response compared to the somewhat slower and less defined response on the lower mid-range. Overall though, I don't think it's all that bad, honestly, especially with the upper mid-range being as articulate or as engaging as it is. It's a very snappy, very detailed, but not harsh presentation. Problem really comes to the lower mid-range and just transition from low to high notes. For that, I will be giving the AFUL Performer 5 a 7 out of 10 for the mid-range. Moving on to the treble, this is a very smoothly done treble with not a lot of peaks and harshness, although there can be some aggression as it is slightly more elevated than your usual neutrally tuned IEMs. But it is very technical, it is very detail oriented. There's a lot of nuance in the vocals and instruments. Percussive instruments, especially string instruments, just feel really alive while not sounding all that harsh, and I really like that. Although I do have a slight issue with the amount of air in the upper extensions or the upper frequencies of the AFUL Performer 5 that I kinda didn't really enjoy that much. But it is a very safe and it's a very well-tuned treble response with good detail, good dynamics, good snappiness. Although I will note that there's a slight BA timbre to it, but I honestly didn't find it too annoying, as the warmer, more lush sounding bass somewhat balances out that more metallic and more bright sounding treble. For that, I will be giving the AFUL Performer 5 an 8 out of 10 for its treble response. Moving on to the technicalities, however, I found this odd congestion with the overall sound quality. This all kind of started with the bass response being a bit too slow and kind of muddies up the overall spaciousness and cleanliness of the AFUL Performer 5, especially with the stages. It feels quite intimate. Separation and imaging also gets affected there, although not as bad as the staging, as I do find myself being able to still pinpoint the details generally, especially in the upper frequencies, as it was quite clean. But again, when it starts to go down to the lower frequencies, I had a kind of an issue with how clean and how spacious the overall presentation of the lower frequencies are. For that, I can really only give the AFUL Performer 5 a 7 out of 10, as it's not really the worst technically performing IEM, especially in this price, but that lower mid-range, that base region just kind of feel like it ruins the overall technical balance of the Performer 5. Now, let's move on to multimedia and gaming. Starting with environmental games and movies, they were somewhat underwhelming. I didn't find them all of that engaging. It's well-tuned, no harshness, no peakiness or whatever, especially in more aggressive and more powerful scenes. But I also didn't feel all that engaged with, watching movies and playing more environmental games. The same goes for more esports-oriented games, as the mushiness in the lower mids kind of ruins the imaging and the accuracy of where I would pinpoint where enemies could be. I honestly didn't really enjoy gaming or watching movies with the Performer 5, but what I did enjoy is just general, regular browsing around the internet, working, just having it on and blend into your ears. It was so comfortable, the tuning is so safe, no pressure buildup, no pain points, no pressure points. It's just honestly a really comfortable IEM to wear. However, comfort isn't enough to make it a good performer, no pun intended, for the overall multimedia and gaming section. Therefore, I can only really give it a Performer 5 stars out of 5. Sorry, 5 out of 10. And lastly, let's wrap it up by talking about some comparisons, starting with the TangZu Heyday. Heyday is about $200, with the Performer 5 being $20 more at $219, technically $220. They both sport a somewhat slight U-shaped sound signature, but I just felt like the Heyday was a bit more balanced. Bass is a lot tighter, but more textured and detailed. Mids are more coherent, more articulate, a little bit more aggressive, but still honestly really well done. And then the treble, this is the part where I think that the Performer 5 is smoother and overall generally more safe to listen to for longer periods of time. But again, the Heyday is more articulate in that treble response, albeit a little bit more aggressive. In terms of technicalities, yeah, no, the Heyday just wins in every single regard, especially staging. The staging of the Heyday is insane. Next, let's compare it to the BQEYZ Winter, which is $239, just about $10 more expensive than the Performer 5. The Performer 5 is slightly U-shaped, but the BQEYZ Winter is more of a neutral, balanced, with slight warm tilt in its overall sound signature. The bass response is somewhat tighter, cleaner, but still not as controlled as I want it to be on the Winter, but it's definitely more bodied in my opinion. Mid-range is also cleaner on the Winter actually, as I found both male and female vocals having a even balance of forwardness and body to them. But there's a slight hint of weirdness in its tonality. But again, the BQEYZ Winter does use a bone conduction driver, which could potentially make my experience vary from depending on my fit and the tips that I use. So again, take it with a grain of salt. Try it out if you can, but in my opinion, the mid-range of the BQEYZ Winter is a lot more neutral sounding compared to the Performer 5. And then when it comes to the treble, again, Performer 5 is just such a smooth treble, but I will say that the Winter's treble is just slightly more edging in terms of detail and nuance compared to the Performer 5, but it also makes it a bit more aggressive, and not as aggressive as the Heyday, but it is quite aggressive if you are definitely treble sensitive. They do have a similar issue with congestion, especially in the air region, but I would say that the Winter is still a little bit better. Lastly, let's compare it to the SeeAudio Yume 2. The Yume 2 is priced at $200, which is, again, $20 less than the Performer 5. They both sport a similar U-shaped sound signature and similar hybrid, actually, with the Yume 2 having only 2 BAs while the Performer 5 has 4. The SeeAudio Yume 2 and the Performer 5 have a similar, not as impactful bass response, but I will say that the Yume 2 is a lot leaner and cleaner sounding, but it also sounds less bodied and somewhat less textured compared to the Performer 5. The mid-range is definitely much leaner on the Yume 2 compared to the Performer 5, as there's a bit more of a upper mids elevation compared to the Performer 5. So this is definitely something to take note of if you're more sensitive to this region. But I will say that they're equally as articulate, as the mid-range of both the Performer 5 and the Yume 2 have this nice, somewhat forward quality without sounding too harsh. Lastly, let's talk about the treble, which is this is the biggest difference between the Performer 5 and the Yume 2, with the Performer 5 rolling off quite early on, while the SeeAudio Yume 2 is a lot more bright and more airy sounding. The Yume 2 is a lot more elevated compared to the Performer 5, which makes it a lot more aggressive and more, I guess you can say, harsh in terms of how it's presenting the treble region. Although, if you are definitely more of a treble head like me, you'll definitely like the Yume 2 more. And in terms of technicalities, again, quite similar, but the Yume 2 edges the Performer 5 in terms of head stage and just overall expansiveness, as the separation and the imaging is also much cleaner on the SeeAudio Yume 2 due to its more airy and more open sound. So overall, what do I think of the Performer 5? Well, I think that the Performer 5 is a very safe choice in the $200 bracket, where you're not really looking for something all that articulate, but you're looking for something well-tuned, something clean, something somewhat lush sounding, something that you won't really think much about. But this is definitely not the most articulate, not the most technically capable, and definitely not the most coherent sounding IEM that I've tried, especially in this price region, as the bass just sounds so sloppy and the incoherency in the mids kind of ruins the overall balance in terms of how dynamic and how transient its transient ability is. And honestly, I really just didn't like the Performer 5 all that much, but I can understand and I can see the market that the Performer 5 is in for, and that's people who are looking for a nice, safe, and relaxing tonality. But considering the price range of $200, where it's absolutely filled with amazing IEMs, like all of the comparisons that I've compared the Performer 5 to, I would definitely say that the Performer 5 only is good if you're looking for something tonally good. It's not the most competitive choice, but it's definitely a good choice, and again, it is a choice for you to pick in that $200 bracket. Do I think it's bad? Absolutely not. It's a wonderful IEM with a bit of glaring issues to it. But at the end of the day, this Performer 5 performs quite well, especially as a new kid on the block. And that is the AFUL Performer 5. Thank you so much for watching. Honestly, I'm still trying to figure out what my setup's gonna be, and you know, it's kind of a hectic thing. It's kind of just more of a ramble section, so if you don't interest that, you can just leave if you want. I'm kidding, please don't leave. But like, you know, just it's just fun doing this. I'm really glad you went through the entire video. I'm trying my best. If you guys have any suggestions for how I should do my setup, definitely suggest it in the comment section. But again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Ding that notification bell to get latest news and reviews coming from OB Audio. And yeah, that's kind of about it. I'll hear you next time. Ciao.